Okay, good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, we will get started in a moment. We are just getting started. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program, Recognizing Reentry, Anxiety in a Post-Pandemic World. My name is Megan Burns, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at the TAA. This program is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association of America in partnership with the CDC. During the webinar, we'd welcome all of your responses and questions, so you can use the questions panel. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can type your questions into Facebook and we'll try to get to them all. Funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Phelps, so please go ahead and start with your presentation.
Great, thanks so much. So welcome everybody. We probably have a handful of folks here with us on Zoom, and then we are live here on Facebook. So as everybody comes in, you'll see there's a chat function that many of you are probably very familiar with in this era where we're using technology more and more. I would invite you to use that chat function to put any questions, comments, things you want us to talk about. This presentation is going to be around 25 to 30 minutes or so, and so we'll definitely save some time towards the end for a lot of conversation about reentry anxiety, and we can certainly talk a good bit just generally about tics or some of the co-occurring conditions that many folks live with. So thank you, Megan, for that introduction. I really appreciate that. It's really nice to be together as a community, especially when so much of our togetherness has really been lost for the last 15, 16 months. And it's especially nice to join you on Tourette Awareness Month. And so most of you know that, but if you're not already, I would make sure you're sharing lots of things on social media to try to raise awareness and advocate for tic disorders and Tourette syndrome. It is my pleasure to be with you. I'm here in South Carolina. Megan and I were talking earlier about I'm in the office because I've got a few children who are winding down for bed at home. So if I was there, they would most certainly be making a appearance. So I'm here at work and looking forward to talking with you about this topic. So, you know, our hopes really for this evening is we're going to look back and sort of look forward. So as we look back, one thing we're going to do is talk about the American Psychological Association Stress in America survey. And we're going to talk about, as we move forward, this concept of reentry anxiety and how many individuals are feeling as life slowly gets back to normal. So I want to start with this visual. This visual comes out of Yale Medicine, and it's really just the timeline of where we've been and what we've been through. And I think it's important to revisit this before we talk about where we are now. So in January of last year, this mysterious new illness appeared in Wuhan, and then quickly began to spread to other places like Europe. Later became known, obviously, as COVID-19. And in March and April of last year, as the virus spread, the world began to shut down, right? So borders became sealed, events were canceled, children went home for schooling, people began working from home, things we never thought we would see ourselves doing. And this concept, this language we had never heard of before, social distancing, really took hold. And there's been critiques of that language. Many individuals say we should have called it physical distancing, because unfortunately the ramifications are we not only physically distance from each other, but at times emotionally and socially distance from connecting with other people. We thought there could be an ending. I remember my wife and I talking and thinking, oh, this might last 14 days or 15 days, not thinking this was going to last 14 months or 15 months. And we thought there was light at the end of the tunnel in May and June, but the numbers went down and then back up, depending upon where you are in the world or your geography. But in July and here in America, we saw a real concern for mental health issues. People began struggling more and more with unemployment, juggling taking care of children, plus doing things like preparing for school. And we know that the numbers went up and up and up. So in December, as the vaccines became a real possibility, there was new hope, but there was also some anxiety about potential variants that might emerge. And so this year we're in this space where now there's a real push for vaccination, and we're seeing the numbers come down. So it does seem as if there's going to be hope. However, it would be remiss for me not to acknowledge and mention the 167 million individuals who've had COVID-19 and the almost 3.5 million people who've died from this virus. So we've really had a communal trauma and a worldwide pandemic that we're all reeling from. And our other stressors in our life have continued alongside this. So it's been a really hard time. And so I want to share with you what the American Psychological Association found in their survey. So the APA does this survey periodically. And the survey I'm going to talk about is the most recent one that was done in February 19th through the 24th, where they surveyed about 3,000 American adults who are older than the age of 18. And really, they were looking for what's been sort of the impact on individuals and what do we know about mental health for individuals who are surveyed. So notably, the executive director, Dr. Arthur Evans of the APA, Dr. Arthur Evans said, "We've been concerned throughout this pandemic about the level of prolonged stress, exacerbated by grief, trauma, and isolation that Americans have experiencing, and really this pertains to around the world. This survey reveals a secondary crisis that's likely to have persistent, serious mental and physical health consequences for years to come." So what does that look like? We know that, when the people were surveyed, about 50% or so had delayed healthcare appointments or canceled health visits. And in part because of that and other just restrictions that had to occur throughout the pandemic, about 53% of people became less physically active. And we know that things like almost 70% of people were sleeping more or sleeping less than they really wanted to. So all these added up to it being expressed really notably for a few populations. And one of them were parents. And there may be many parents tuning in, but we know there was significant implications for parents' mental and physical health. When they were surveyed, mothers, almost 40% reported more mental health implications than fathers, who reported 25%. We would expect to see that trend, as we know mothers tend to bear the bulk of the responsibility for caretaking and tend to be juggling a lot of different responsibilities because of histories of cultural norms in our society. But when fathers had the impact, close to 25% also had that impact, and fathers had worse sleep, worse weight changes, and more drinking behavior as well. 75% of people said they needed more emotional support. 32% said they received treatment for mental health, and close to a quarter, 25%, were diagnosed with a mental health disorder since the pandemic started. When you look at, one of the things that I found most notable about the survey is when you look at weight changes, 61% of those surveyed reported undesired weight changes since the start of the pandemic. And amongst US adults, the average weight gain was 29 pounds. And amongst essential workers and amongst parents, it was closer to 36, 38 pounds. But also we saw many individuals lost significant amount of weight too. So being at home, restricted to our homes, being unable to exercise or engage in life as normal had particular implications if you look at these graphs for individuals who would fall in what we call the Gen Z population or millennials. These are our emerging adults, those 18 to 24-year-olds or those 25 to 42-year-olds. And if you think about these populations, these are those sort of college students who are trying to emerge and launch into their life, or that 25 to 42 age range that may have children who are school age. And we know these groups were significantly impacted by the pandemic. If you look at essential workers, similar to the numbers I shared earlier, about 34% had received treatment and about 25% had been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And it's really odd, right, as a therapist in this sort of work, often we are not living the crisis while we're counseling people in a crisis. And so that's where a lot of essential health workers found themselves. And so this is why we believe we saw these increased numbers of burnout and stress. If you look across groups, one thing we saw is when you look, individuals who fall in minority groups, Black, Hispanic, and Asian individuals reported higher rates of concerns about the future, being really concerned about not being comfortable with living life after the pandemic and what it might be like, or being uneasy to this adjustment to in-person interaction. And, you know, if you think about, we just celebrated the killing of George Floyd. Yes, we just acknowledged the death of George Floyd yesterday, as well as the constant news reports of Asian Americans being assaulted. You know, it's not surprising that individuals in these communities are really, really struggling from these losses. So what do we know about the impact on children and the impact on adolescents? One thing that I feel like I should mention is we knew that even pre-pandemic, rates of anxiety and depression and suicide and self-harm we were seeing some trends that were concerning that were increasing. And then through the pandemic, we saw many families dealing with loss, financial distress, kids being pulled out of school from their friends because of concerns for safety with the virus. And so this data comes from a systematic review, and that means they looked at 16 studies from lots of different countries, which amounted to about 40,000 children and adolescents. They looked at folks from US, China, the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, Canada, the Philippines, and Denmark. And what they found was there were heightened rates of anxiety, depression, as well as substance use. And the individuals who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or questioning particularly struggled with mental health when they were in family systems that were unsupportive of those identities because they were isolated in those social contexts. We saw that individuals who had things like anorexia or bulimia had a 70% increase in poor eating habits. And finally, individuals who had a history of maltreatment had higher rates of their PTSD symptoms. So I would anecdotally share with you that here at our clinic, I direct a child and adolescent psychiatry clinic, we've seen about a threefold increase in referrals for mental health treatment for kids. And I hear a good bit about grief and loss or fearing what the future might look like, a great deal of loneliness. I would say particularly for our kids with ADHD, learning difficulties, or just kids in general who are trying to learn in this new way. This year has brought all sorts of academic confusion. You know, like, how do I sign on? And I can't hear my teacher, and I can't get the tutoring support I need. And families, when trying to help with that, can lead to a lot of conflict. We know that idle time has been a thing and led to depressive symptoms. And for some folks, we've seen more anxiety and OCD, as well as a worsening of tics. However, there's been sort of the alternative experience as well. I have heard similarly from many clients that I see that they feel like they have an appreciation for people in their lives, for family. They've been able to virtually hang out with friends and connect in different ways. They've had to become increasingly creative or playful and trying to figure out how to cope with this. And the thing I've probably heard the rarest is sibling connection. You know, siblings, we can sometimes butt heads a little bit with our siblings, but I have heard it on the rare occasion that siblings are connecting. And for some of the individuals who live with Tourette syndrome and tics, I've heard that, you know, being pulled from those social environments, for some people, it's actually led to an improvement in their tic-related symptoms. And only now, as we think about returning life to normal and the anxiety that might come with that, they may have really felt a worsening of those tic-related symptoms. So let's talk about, for our last half here, reentry anxiety. Those of you who've attended any talks I've done with the Tourette Association before know I like imagery and metaphors. And the way that I think about this is almost as if all of us have been dropped into this very long and confusing and overwhelming maze. And we, as you can imagine, if you were in this maze, are trying to find our way out and trying to find our way out and hoping we'll find our way out. We think we found the exit. We think we found a way out, but we haven't. And so after months and months and months of many of us walking around in this maze, we now find ourselves kind of at the edge of this maze, being able to, what looks like perhaps move out of this confusing experience and overwhelming experience. And understandably, that is causing a good bit of anxiety. I do want to say that everybody has different lived experiences. If you asked anybody walking out of this maze, what has this been like for you? You're going to hear a lot of different experiences of what it's felt like for the last year. But here are some common things that we think about. What we know is that change and transition is hard. And we've been asked to go through a lot of changes and a lot of transition in the last year. You know, our brains really like we know what's going to happen, we know what's going to occur today, we know what's going to occur tomorrow, and we've been thrown into this uncertainty. And we often say uncertainty is a prime breeding ground for a whole lot of anxiety. Like, what if this happens? What if that happens? And the way this is sounded is, in the past, we might be thinking things like, will this ever end? Or we might be thinking things like, will this get better? What will life look like in the future? In the now, we might be thinking, you know, how long before I need a booster shot? Will I need another vaccination? You know, is the concerning and scary things we see happening to our friends and family in India, is that going to proceed with another variant? You know, how are they coping, and how might that affect the rest of the world? You know, we might be thinking about choices now of, should I wear a mask here? Should I not? What's the rule here? What's not? Are people judging me if I wear a mask or don't? How do I feel? What do my values tell me to do? And then there may be some tick related concerns, like if I have a coughing tick or a throat clearing tick in person with other people, will people be concerned that I may have something like COVID-19? So this is really leading to a number of anxiety related concerns. And also our brains have been attuned to a lot of environmental cues. So never before really in the last year have we been so aware of how close or far away people are than us. Are they 6 feet? Are they 3 feet? Are they further than that? We've never been as aware for things like, is someone wearing a mask or are they not? Or has someone touched something or have they not? Like, how communal are these things we're touching? You know, some people have thought about those things, you know, but a lot of us have not thought about that. And we've been almost primed to think about those things more in the last year. So to cope, what we often do is we try to gather information. But part of where we've been is we may be getting different guidelines from our local versus our state versus our federal officials, which can be mind-boggling of knowing what to do, and wherever you travel may have different guidelines about how to manage this. And I've talked to colleagues in other countries, and they've said similar things exist. So I want us to think about this. Think of anxiety as not a categorical thing. I want us to think less about it like you have anxiety or you don't. And I want us to think about it tonight as existing a little bit more on a continuum, where the red end of the continuum is being more anxious and the green end of the continuum is being less anxious. And of those of you who've tuned in, or those of you who are watching this, we may be in all different places on this continuum. And depending on what we've got going on, we might move up and down this continuum. One thing to be mindful of is it's been sort of named at times double anxiety. So if before the pandemic and all of this, you were living, let's say, with OCD or contamination fears, or if before this you were living with some social anxiety, right, and struggled in social interaction, Or if you dealt with body dysmorphia, right, where you struggled with how you looked or your body image, that was already there. And then we've been doing things like being on Zoom calls where we look at ourselves for 7 hours a day, right? That primes us to be more anxious. So we know that if you've already had an anxiety disorder, this return to life as quote unquote normal may certainly put you a little bit higher up on that continuum. And my hope for our last 10 minutes here is to give you some strategies to like stop that continuum climb, to help pull you back maybe just a little bit as life returns to normal. So one of the most important things I would want to share with you is that though we've been pulled back and bottled up, that we probably will not do well if we hit the ground running from 0 to 60 here. That this is probably going to require one step at a time. And to think of it like in therapy when we do what's called exposure therapy. So if for someone had a fear, for instance, of bugs, and they said, this is really affecting my life, and I don't want to be as impacted by this, we wouldn't take them from never touching or being around bugs to being at a beehive or something and wearing the suit, right? That would be so overwhelming. We would have to take very small graded steps. The same thing may need to apply here. I think in many ways, as the school system has moved from going from completely virtual to doing things in a hybrid way to doing things all in person, that sort of models that like slowly moving back into life as normal. And one way to think about this is we may rank it almost using a menu of 0 to 10. Like, what are the things that are going to be a 10 out of 10 hard for you? So being outside, being unmasked, being around other people who are family or friends or strangers, like, is that a 0 or is that a 10? Because for some of us, that may be a 5 or 6 or 7, and others, that may be a 0. And this can help you figure out like where to start and how to move yourself up. If you're expected to go back to work, could you take part of a vacation day and go back at first for 4 hours or 5 hours and then go back for your 8-hour day or 9-hour day to kind of slowly get yourself back into that environment? The reasons why that'd be important is we're not used to the sensory experience of walking out and being surrounded by people, being around noisy crowds, or being in proximity to people, or the experience of lights or sounds around us, which could be very overwhelming for some folks who live with tics and Tourette syndrome. Also, people have described to me a vulnerability of not being masked, and individuals looking at our face in person or feeling like we don't have that feeling on our face that we're used to having. And so practicing being out without a mask in safe places in small doses may help to kind of habituate and socialize to that new normal. And then finally, many of us have not had a lot of practice with in-person social interaction, over the last year. We've been doing a lot of it virtually. And so it feels different to do that out and about. So doing that in small ways is really going to be important. I like to use the imagery of a cup. So if you can see me, there's a cup here, and thinking about how full is your cup. And so your cup sort of is your emotional reservoir of how you've been feeling. And there are certain things you may do to fill your cup, like self-care stuff. That like some days you may wake with a full cup, and other days you may wake with an almost empty cup. And the days you're going to try harder things, or things that may be a little bit more overwhelming for you, you may want to do those things on days where your cup is a little bit more full, or do them with people that you would consider to be a support person or someone who's really got your back and knows how hard this can be sometimes. A few more skills here that I would think about. Part of it is hard to know what to do if you don't notice and name what's showing up. And what I mean by this is that often we move into a social interaction or move into life getting back to normal and don't check in as much with our body and with our thoughts and what is happening right now for me in this situation. Psychology, we sometimes say, if you name it, then you might be able to tame it. But if you don't name it, it could very well take you over in many ways. So some of this is noticing your body and naming and describing internally what's going on. Like, I notice my mind is going a little faster right now, or I notice I'm feeling warmer in the situation, or I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now with what's happening. Or I notice I'm having a lot of worry thoughts. Or I notice I feel pretty comfortable in this situation, and naming that and normalizing that this is probably the first time, not probably, it is one of the first times you've done this. You have never before in your life reintegrated into society after a pandemic. So to say to yourself, me and millions of people across the world are getting life back to normal. And this feeling, this is a common humanity. Many of us are struggling with getting back to any sense of normalcy. So there's nothing wrong with me that I'm having this feeling right now, but it's this new thing that I'm trying to take in. Brene Brown, who's a wonderful speaker and writer, she writes a lot about shame, has a really great podcast. And in her first podcast, she talked about importance of naming a first time, the first time you do this thing. And I think that's really important to say, this is the first time. So anxiety is going to show up here because I've not done this before. And then doing some things to try to neutralize that. And that might mean taking small breaks, doing things to self-soothe with your senses, saying a prayer if spirituality or religion is important to you, texting or calling somebody who understands, but this way of trying to really make sure that you're taking care of yourself as you move back into hard stuff that we're not used to as much as we used to be. One thing you heard me mention earlier is our mind likes structure and predictability. So if you're reintegrating back and entering back into this new way of being, it would be pretty important to make sure that you're trying to do it in as much of a structured and predictable way as you could. Where are you going to go? How long are you going to stay? What's it going to be like? What's the schedule perhaps going to be like? How has the environment changed? If you can find out any of that ahead of time, that'll probably help you out. And then to make the outing worth it, right? If it's hard right now to get out socially or do things or re-enter, I would say get the most bang for your buck, right? So do things that may bring pleasure, that may make you feel like you've accomplished what you wanted to accomplish, or may involve some degree of socialization with people you really enjoy being around. This is really the treatment for people who have severe depression, we call behavioral activation. Scheduling yourself to do things that may have in the past been pleasurable or led to that sense of I mastered something, I did something really, really hard. And so if you're going to go out, I might say go out and do things that mean something to you rather than if going to the grocery store doesn't do that, you could order those groceries in, and save that outing for something that's going to be worth it for you if you know it's going to be hard. I would also say, my grandmother used to say, idle time's the devil's playground. And I think there's some truth to that often sitting and being with our own thoughts too long can be overwhelming. And the same thing might apply to the news and to technology. I know that that watching the news is important to stay informed, and you've probably heard this a lot in the last year. But when we hear that day after day after day after day, or all through our day, that has an impact, of course, on our mood and how we're feeling. So you just set some boundaries with yourself. So for myself, I may read a news story in the morning or read it for 5 or 10 minutes, but try not to look at it again during the day. And that just helps to set some healthy boundaries, because two things can happen with technology. One is we get these constant visual cues of potential danger or death or loss or tragedy. And the second thing that we might see is we maybe have a tendency to compare ourselves to other people who look as if they have it all together on social media. And it helps us, not feel as well because we feel more inferior and looking at those other images. So it's something to just really be conscientious about. Our last two things here is one is about communication with other people. To try to communicate from a place of talking about what you need. This is what I feel comfortable with. This is what I need. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do this post-pandemic, but this is where I'm at. This is what I need and what I feel like is important to me. And setting boundaries where you can and thinking everybody's coming out of this maze, right, in very different places. And I would do your best to avoid what we call triangulation. And what does this mean? Triangulation means when two people are having a problem or an issue, one of the most common things we do in a relationship is we go and find a third party and say, you'll never believe what so-and-so said. And that actually tends to fuel the frustration, fuel the anger, and fuel the difficulty. So whenever possible, and this comes up a lot with family, sometimes with colleagues, sometimes with even strangers, but communicating where you're at. And sometimes for individuals who are living with tics, that might mean if you're going to have tics in a public setting, of asking ourselves the question, is this a place where I want to disclose this or I don't want to disclose this? And kind of navigating some of those choices, which we can talk some more about in the question and answer. Finally, the last skill I want to mention is something we sometimes call attentional focusing, or building the positive affect. What we know is that our minds tend to have a negativity bias, right? If we're walking through a forest, it makes a lot more sense for our mind to think that stick is a snake instead of a stick, because it's there to try to keep us safe. So as we move back out into society, our mind is primed, our brain is primed to look for risk and aversives and negatives and to remember those. So when we have positive moments, when we have moments of connection, it's important to not just notice that, but lean into it, savor it, think about it, share it with someone later, look at pictures of the moment, write about the moment, create a list of the gratitude of the moment. It may seem like overkill to do this, but it just helps to kind of move their mind a little bit away from that negativity bias into a little bit more of a balanced perspective. Say, I was worried about all these things when I went out, but this was the good part of that outing. This is what went well about that. When I went back to school, or when I went to the store, or when I went to visit a family member. And then, as a last point, I've heard more and more people talking to me about, though this pandemic came with a whole host of negative and awful things, might there have been something at all in the last year that we want to hold on to? I know in about halfway through the pandemic, my youngest son broke his femur. And so he was in a full body cast for 8 weeks. And so a piece of that is, we had to do all sorts of caretaking that we didn't expect was going to happen in the midst of a pandemic. But the silver lining is that means we got lots of time with him at home where we might not have. And we had the blessing of having jobs that gave us a little bit of time off to be there and care for him. So there's not always a silver lining, but if there is any way of saying, is there anything about this that I want to keep? Am I not doing the extracurricular running here, there, and everywhere now? Did this pandemic give me some time with people I love and care about? And do I appreciate the importance of my loved ones, because anything could happen? Is there anything that we can kind of hold on to from this devastating thing that's happened to all of us? So this is like the end of a marathon, right? This pandemic. Many of us are weary and fatigued, but I want to end by saying that we made it through. It seems as if we've made it, and it's a time, I pray and hope, that we're turning back to community, we're turning back to what matters, we're turning back to our relationships, and we're turning back to hopefully a place of more compassion and care. So we like to use our last 20, 30 minutes here, however much time we have, to use it as a discussion. So I think Megan has been thoughtfully collecting questions, and we had some submitted ahead of time, and we'll do our best to cover what we can get to, I think. Right, Megan?
Yes. So first and foremost, thank you, Dr. Phelps. We've been getting some really positive comments on Facebook and both here on Zoom, that people are really loving the cup analogy. So thank you for sharing that. Just as a reminder to everyone tuning in, you can submit your questions. If you're on Facebook, you can type them into the chat, or in Zoom, you can put them in the chat. But we'll get started with some here. So we're getting some good stuff in. As a parent, Dr. Phelps, as a parent with a recently diagnosed child with Tourette syndrome, how can we help manage the interaction with their school to ensure that they successfully reintegrate with the student body?
Yeah, wonderful question. I think one of the things that can be the hardest, I find, for families, but one of the most important, is figuring out how to develop a really collaborative relationship with the school, and that they understand your child's strengths and their struggles. And I see a lot of families navigate this beautifully. And some of it is by getting as involved as they can if they have the time and energy to do so. So if you can volunteer at the school, try to schedule a meeting, help out in some way. I've been to a number of IEP meetings where the family brought cookies. I know that sounds maybe ridiculous, but I think people like cookies, and it shows a thoughtfulness and a care and a greeting of people as we resume in person. And I think it just shows that you want to partner with them. You want to be on the same page with the school. I think there are a number of outstanding resources on the Tourette Association YouTube page. I'd encourage you to go to YouTube and the Tourette Association, where this will probably be posted as well. And there are some wonderful talks on there about IEPs, 504s, how do you advocate in a school environment. I think number one, the relationship is crucial and is very important, as long as you can try to keep that collaborative relationship with the school. And number two, I would start with, if we're talking about Tourette syndrome, right, what do they know about tics? What do they know about Tourette syndrome? Have they had a child in the school before who had tics and Tourette's? And it's a very individualized diagnosis. Different kids have different tics, because they may have a lot of misconceptions about what the child may be like before they even get there. And then to paint a picture of your child's strengths and struggles, and then give them resources like the TAA has some good educator toolkits that can be a great thing to share with the school. And if you're working with somebody like a psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist or someone who can advocate for you and call the teachers or call them or send a letter, I find that also sets them up for success as well too. But I would highly encourage you to look at the YouTube page, because they have a lot of wonderful resources, full hour talks on this topic that can really help guide you, as well as how to work in that school system.
Yeah, I was going to say too, just to add, so if you go to tourette.org/resources, you can download all of the toolkits that Dr. Phelps mentioned that are super helpful in helping with some of that too. Okay, so we have another one here. My daughter's OCD impacts her most, and I have yet to find a psychologist or therapist to help find strategies to deal with repetitive questions for reassurance and hoarding issues during these uncertain times. Do you have any suggestions there?
Absolutely. One thing I didn't mention in the last one that I think is also an additional thing. Me and my wife, after about the first week or two of school, we try to write a little note or have our kids write a note telling the teachers thank you for helping us have a strong start to the school year. And sometimes we'll put in a $5 Starbucks gift card or something. But it's a thoughtful little thing that that helps them realize you want to partner with them. So I think that it's not uncommon for our young people and adults who present with tics and Tourette's to come with OCD or anxiety that may be even sometimes more impairing. About 90% of people with tics often deal with those really concerning co-occurring conditions. And to find resources, let me start there. The Tourette Association of America has a find a provider function, but there are other organizations that really specialize in OCD and anxiety. And one is the International OCD Foundation, which the TAA partners some with, the IOCDF, as well as the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapists. And this is an organization where you can search and try to find a therapist. And in looking at an academic medical center, I know it can be a good resource as well if there's one of those nearby where individuals may be doing something like cognitive behavioral therapy or family work to help with accommodation. That word is a really important one, because often a piece of OCD and anxiety is asking for reassurance or asking a parent or loved one to sort of help in the compulsive behavior to help relieve the anxiety. But as this parent alluded to, it can backfire because it keeps you engaged in that example of obsessive compulsion. So there's some good books. I think that, to give those resources. A brand new book that's actually right here on my bookcase. It's called Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD by Dr. Eli Leibowitz. And it was actually just released this year, Breaking Free from Child Anxiety and OCD. And also Stuff That's Loud is a really fun little book written by Ben Sedley and Lisa Coyne. And it's a good book written for teenagers to read as well. The short answer is we often don't want to just cut off accommodation, because if we just cut it off, you're often going to get a lot of really significant behavioral outbursts and it's too much too fast. Think about that staircase, slow and steady. So we often want to try to partner with a young person or a family to fade accommodation as much as we can. And so that takes some collaboration and some work with the treatment provider. But the books will also help guide you through that and some of the resources. Just as if they were compulsively washing their hands, we wouldn't say, okay, we're going to do exposures where we just stop doing that altogether tomorrow. That might not be possible because the person's living with OCD. We may try to change that in some way, shorten the time, do small exposures while limiting washing. And so these are the kind of things we do for anxiety and OCD if something's too much or too big, to kind of chip away at it over time.
Okay, so we're seeing a bunch of questions that are coming in. I'm looking on Facebook as well. And they're all kind of similar in the fashion about seeing an increased amount of tics during the pandemic. So one question here said, my son started with tics during the pandemic. The stress of combining cohorts and moving to full day school significantly increased his tics to include vocal tics. Last week, he was formally diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. So have you seen an increase in tic disorders in children since the pandemic? And why do you think that may be?
Yes, without a doubt. I mentioned broadly from our clinic's perspective of child psychiatry. So this would include everything from behavioral concerns, ADHD, anxiety, depression, suicide attempts, right? We've seen a massive increase in those things. But I personally, as the person internally who does a lot of work with tics and Tourette's, have seen double, close to triple the referrals for tic-related conditions from both our adult neurology service and our pediatric neurology service. I think some of that is there is an immense amount of confusion that we've had in the last year about our day-to-day life and what tomorrow will look like, and all that uncertainty builds lots of anxiety. I also think that we are not built for this, to be overly simplistic, as human beings. And when I think about myself as a 10-year-old, right? The idea that I would have been able to sit in front of a computer for 6-7 hours and try to learn, I mean, kudos to all of our teachers out there. I spent a good bit of time at home with my kids trying to do some schooling while seeing people. And I was continually amazed by how energetic and enthusiastic the teachers remained through the whole year. But no matter how wonderful they have been, that takes a toll not only on them, but also the kids. So I think one of the main reasons is because just neurologically, we're not built to be doing what we're doing. And so if you put people in a social context that they're not built to, where it's harder to walk or run or be physically active, it's harder to see our friends or socially be engaged with other people, and we feel really stressed. We know that tics are a neurological condition, but environmental factors and stressors can kind of push and pull and make them happen more or less. And we've been under a lot of stress. And so I think it is primarily for some individuals because of the heightened stress of the demands that have been placed on us. I think for other individuals, being pulled from stressful contexts and being in a home environment that may feel safe or secure has actually reduced their tics. So I've kind of seen both patterns. And for that second group, I've often seen in the last 3 to 4 months, more increase in tics as they think about life getting back to normal and what that might mean in the coming months.
Great. Okay, so this one's for our young adults who are tuning in right now. Is there any advice or strategies that you have on how to handle the emotional load of going from the freedom of working from home, not being aware of tics in the last year, back into the energy expenditure that will happen when I must be mindful of my tics again? I work in a large open space, so I'll need to be more mindful of my distractions, etc. So any advice there?
Yeah. Whoever wrote that question deserves a huge pat on the back. They have amazing languaging, right? Language is so interesting and important. I mean, if you think about the visual of emotional load, I think that's a wonderful thing, a way of putting it. It feels like a heavy burden or load on our shoulders as we think about this for many of us. And the energy expenditure, right? I caught that phrase too. Like, it takes a lot of energy. I do see the comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics, and it takes a lot of energy to use competing responses, and it can take a lot of energy to try to use some of the strategies. So two things come to mind. One thing is, I think if it possible, it may be important to try to slowly reintegrate into that work setting. Even if you get permission from a supervisor or someone to go in for part of a day or a couple hours here and there, or when you're in the work setting, to ask yourself, might I be able to break up my lunch and take a 30-minute in the morning or a 30-minute in the afternoon or 15 minutes spread throughout the day? So I am spreading out my self-care, like sprinkling it throughout the day, may be an important or helpful thing to think about, just because the work environment may be overstimulating. But the second thing that kind of came to my mind about the question is maybe asking yourself the question, do I want to expend the energy to manage these tics, right? And that I caught the idea that I'm worried my tics are going to bother other people, or I'm concerned that they may disrupt the environment in some way, but yet people in the environment aren't saying anything or aren't commenting on them, right? And so it's sort of balancing for this person, how much do they personally want to manage these symptoms versus maybe moving into the freedom of saying, I'm going to let some of my tics come, right? I'm not going to use that energy of suppressing, and I'm going to try to let some of them be, and see if my colleagues and my work friends and the people I'm around may actually be more accepting and open than I might have originally thought. And that's the balance I'm seeing with a lot of people right now. And that's really, in some ways, what CBIT's about. We don't do CBIT if an individual themselves is not bothered by their tics or wants things to change personally. And when I hear someone say, I'm worried about the implication for other people, I'm often having a conversation about the concern about the other people, and might there be a way of sort of talking with other people about what's going on, and leaning into who you are and what role you want tics to play in your life. And sometimes that means people want to use strategies, and sometimes that means individuals need to be themselves, and that tics and Tourette's is part of them. And so what that might look like, I think, is a really individualized question. But going slow and self-care to me would feel super important. Little breaks as much as possible, because you haven't been there probably for the last 18 months. My wife is in finance, and she goes back next week, and she said, this feels overwhelming. This feels like, I don't know if I'm ready to see everybody in person and be in the environment. I feel like I've been able to be so productive at home. So it's a struggle. You're not alone in that. You're not alone in that.
Just so the person who submitted the question is joining us tonight. They said thank you for answering that.
Oh, good.
Some of their biggest tics are throat clearing tics and coughing, so they have anxiety about that. We do, just so that everyone knows, we have an I have TS card, so just in case you need to prepare yourself with that, it can help you explain the condition to any of your colleagues as well. And again, we have ample resources that can help support some of that discussion in the workplace if needed.
Yeah, I think that slow rhythmic breathing, sort of in your mouth and out your nose, and taking some breaks, and maybe just thinking of that card. Are there some people who sit really close to you, or people you might go to lunch with, or people who who say, I don't know if you know this about me, but I have this throat clearing or this coughing tic, and I don't have any other symptoms. I know what it is, part of my neurological condition, and I find most people are really graceful and accepting and open when they know. But that's kind of an individualized thing, how much we share and disclose, I think, in those circumstances. But I forgot about the card. That's a great thing, Megan.
Yeah, no, that has been really helpful. And we actually customized it for COVID specifically. So you can download those versions. We have them in Spanish. So there's a bunch of different versions that people can take advantage of. So just jumping over here to Facebook, a comment that I think might be worth discussing is, it's such a struggle to teach my child who's 12. It's a struggle to teach her not to stress or worry at age 12 when I feel like she's always waiting for the next tick. That in and of itself is stressful. I'm navigating how this feels for her and helping her through that emotion without creating a reason for her to overthink it. I worry that I'm not addressing her emotions in the right way. Any advice there?
Mhm, mhm. Well, when I get those questions from parents, my first response is usually saying, just by hearing your question, right, it shows how much you care and love and want to be helpful, right? Like just saying, oh gosh, I'm thinking about this. Am I doing this right as a mom or dad, or is this the best way to respond? I mean, that in and of itself shows you're trying, and I think that will supersede anything else, right? That you're trying and you're helping as much as you can. When worry and stress shows up for kids and really for adults, I think the first thing that's probably most important is to notice and name it in them as well, and acknowledge it and validate it. So what that might sound like would be like, I'm hearing you, you're feeling really overwhelmed today and you're feeling really stressed, and I want to understand what's going on, and if you're in the middle of something, you might say, I want to talk to you about this. Give mommy, 15 minutes, and I'm going to come back in your room and you can jot some things down and I'll come talk to you. So hearing it a little bit first, creating a little space for it to kind of air out and what's showing up, and normalizing that worry is showing up for a lot of people right now. I think naming it as like, oh, worry showing up right now. You feel those worry thoughts coming. Oh, anxiety showing up kind of in your mind. I've done a couple talks before here, and I think I frequently like the analogy of it being like a parrot on your shoulder. Like anxiety shows up sitting on our shoulder and it sort of squawks in our ear all day long. I have a lot of kids who like Disney movies, or like Iago, who's just, oh, bad things are going to happen. You never know what's going to occur. Like people are going to judge you. And it's trying to be helpful, right? It's trying to be useful. It's trying to warn us about things. It's that negativity bias, but it stinks, right? It's so consuming sometimes. And when you think of it that way, as like this obnoxious, friendly-ish parrot, it gives you a little bit of distance from it. And I think as a parent myself, I think I often feel pulled into wanting to fix it, like give ideas and give strategies. And I think sometimes creating space for it and giving her a frame or a way of thinking about the anxiety, of what it's there for and why it's showing up, can be one of the many helpful ways of doing that.
Nice. I love that analogy with a parrot. Just so you know, the mom that you just answered that question for says she's in tears since you validated the, just asking the question is almost enough at that moment. So
yeah, but one of the moms I saw years ago said, Dr. Phelps, I think part of what happens is when you birth a child, the moment they place it in your arms, they also place a heaping large thought that says, am I doing this good enough? And I think that is, nobody walks around talking about it, but that is the most common thought I hear from parents. Like, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing enough? Am I doing okay? It's super
That's so true.
Yeah.
So we'll actually wind down with our last two questions. So if anyone has submitted something that we haven't gotten to yet, we will make sure to go through all these questions and get back to you. But so second to last question, Dr. Phelps, our child is expressing worry about returning in person this fall back to school. Any ideas on how to prep them to get back into the swing of things?
Yeah, I've heard this from a number of people. The nature of that parrot and worry is that though something may be a month out, 3 months out, 4 months out, our mind has this tendency of catastrophizing or projecting to the future of what is that going to be like? And the last thing many of our kids remembered about school was, if they haven't been back, is when it shut down and all the confusion about that. So I think as much as can be the case over the summer, of can you do a walk by the school? Are you able, if your child has an IEP or 504, go back and do a tour of the school at like 3:30 one day? Certainly if there's a meet the teacher in the fall, can go into those sorts of things. Remember, a lot of this is about uncertainty. So anything that we can do to make the school feel a little bit more familiar, to kind of talk about what it's going to be like, to get pictures or images online of where their classroom is going to be, who their teacher is going to be, as soon as you know those things. I know sometimes it's only a week or two before, but anything to decrease the unknowns may be helpful. And if you're kind of just all at home right now, I think slowly starting to get out there a little bit this summer in ways that you feel comfortable with would be really important. Having kids have sleepovers with other kids or families as you feel comfortable as much as possible, right? Giving them that practice of separation or being somewhere else or spontaneity a little bit. It's going to take practice. And so I wouldn't want to go from nothing in May to full on 5 days a week if you're not already doing some of that as well. So a good bit of practice might be helpful.
So that kind of segues into the last question nicely then. So is there a way that people can choose virtual versus in person? How do you navigate that decision as a family? Because it is a family decision. So how can people help navigate that, especially to your last point, that people, diving back in all 5 days might not be the best decision, especially, for someone with Tourette syndrome or a tic disorder.
Yeah. I've heard that more and more that because some kids have done a little bit better in a homeschool option or a virtual option, some parents are considering that. They're considering in the fall, do we want to continue in that option or do we want to return to in-person? Sometimes, recently in therapy with somebody, I work with a family of just doing kind of a advantages, disadvantages analysis, like what are the advantages to going back in person? What are the disadvantages to going back in person? What are the advantages of doing this at home? And what are the disadvantages of doing this at home? And then if you're going to move into more of a home-based virtual online program that might be available to you, I think of really being mindful of two things. One, that you're choosing the online program or the virtual type school that might best fit with your kid, because there's a lot of different types that may exist out there, kind of pre-COVID and post-COVID. And number two, I see kids who do really well sometimes with home stuff, homeschool and things, but being mindful of where can we incorporate social outings. Can they do a swim team? Can they do a sport? Can they do musical instruments? Can they participate in band or something like that still? Are they doing karate? Like, how can we keep them in social interactive spaces? I think would be really important to make sure they're getting those social and emotional needs met as well.
And just to add to that too, so if anyone's interested on June, I think it's June 17th, I'm just pulling it up here. We are doing a webinar about homeschooling, if it's right, how that works. So as you touch on that, if anyone's more interested in that option for the family, you can visit tourette.org/homeschool, and you can get into that program to help understand that if that's a good option for the family. But I think this is all great stuff. So Dr. Phelps, is there any last parting information, although everything you shared is good and I think it really expands outside of the Tourette community, but is there any last parting notes that you'd want to share with everybody tuning in?
I think that I've said before on many talks that I do that I really do believe that the quality of our lives is often shown through the quality of our relationships. And so much of what this pandemic has brought has been social distancing that led to social isolation. And in a condition like tics and Tourette's that can already at times be very isolating, I think that's my greatest concern. And so, as I think I mentioned earlier, I really do hope that people can find community, and that one good thing that comes out of this pandemic is that we have been so isolated that now we really want to connect with other people, and we want to be together, and we want to value relationships like we never have before. And I think that would be a wonderful thing to come out of a really tragic set of events. And I think advocacy helps with that. So I think spreading awareness is a good way to start this month.
That's amazing. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to spend this evening with you.
You too.
For everyone who would need more information, you could always email support@tourette.org. We have a full-time information and referral staff that can help go through your questions, get you support and resources. Of course, it's Tourette Awareness Month, which we touched on earlier. So you can visit tourette.org/awareness for any resources on how to get involved, share your story, read other people's stories, if that's where you'd like to start. But again, thank you for joining us tonight. And this presentation will be on our YouTube channel and our website, tourette.org. So thank you. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.